Yeah, just welcome everyone. This is a new experience for us. We're in the main stage, which is all very, very exciting. So appreciate you all coming out, especially on Father's Day. My name is Savi Baines. I am one of the gallery assistant curators. We're so pleased to have you join us this afternoon as we celebrate summer exhibitions and much more. I'd like to begin by recognizing that the gallery is located on occupied territory of the Kwantlen, Katzie, and Semiahmoo nations, the stewards of this land. I express my gratitude and respect for the honor of living and working on their unceded and ancestral territory. I also acknowledge my responsibility to learn truths, engage in reconciliation, and continually navigate my relationship with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. I accept this responsibility and work to unlearn and learn what this means for me and future generations. I'd like to also recognize that the gallery and its role in this city for cultivating equitable and inclusive practices with the artists, staff, volunteers, and the diverse communities here, which require a long-term commitment to personal and institutional learning, self-reflection, and transparency. Our work is ongoing. So, this fall, we're celebrating many exhibitions: Mere Phantoms, Shadows Without Borders, Arts 2022, Charles Campbell, Black Bread Spectacle, and Athena Pika, Echoes. We will begin with a talk with Maya Ersan and Jamie Robson of Mere Phantoms. We will also be celebrating recently retired city's culture manager and former gallery curator and director, Leanne Davison. Local artists and community members Jim Adams and Coralie Leger will be paying tribute to her tenure and her many contributions. So thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to now introduce Curator of Exhibitions and Collections, Jordan Strum. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Sylvie. I'm going to talk from this mic for a moment, and then we're going to head over to the setup here. I just wanted to say, I'm going to say a few words about, I guess by way of introduction for our very special guests, one of our exhibiting artists, or two of them. So the exhibition, the talk that we're going to begin with is convened around the timing of this exhibition that's across the foyer down the hall in Gallery 1 and Gallery 2 called Shadows Without Borders. And Mere Phantoms are the artists, and while their creative practice has many shoots and trajectories around the world and across the country, they have deep roots here in Metro Vancouver and in the Lower Mainland here on Coast Salish territory. And among the many number of exhibitions, they've had shows at the Grunt Art Gallery, or the Grunt Gallery, I should say, the Vancouver Art Gallery, the Push Festival, and then also most recently in the exhibition A Seat at the Table at the Museum of Vancouver. Maybe some of you had a chance to see that last year. And so their roots are deep here. They also have studied at Emily Carr and graduated with BFAs back in 2002 and 2003, respectively. So we're thrilled to have them back here and in our midst. Now, their exhibition, many of you have maybe had a chance to poke your heads in or have had a chance to experience their work before, is, they're interactive. They're often presenting quite fantastical worlds that are deeply embedded in the real. Their exhibitions combine a sort of theater of shadows and the art of paper cutting, quite commonly. Their exhibitions deploy a very limited economy of materials, paper, scissors, fabric, cutting X-Acto knives, etc. But within this grouping of objects and materials is primarily this wonderful fascination and working with light. So really, light is their medium. And it makes their creations come alive, as you probably experienced if you've had a chance to go in. So Shadows Without Borders installation, as with so many of their exhibitions, use shadow play to explore the relationship between memory, architecture, people, and place. Their immersive environments challenge traditional artist-audience relationships And as they describe it, spectators become the moderators of their own experience, which I love that phrase. This exhibition has been presented before in a kind of earlier incarnation in Montreal in 2018 at the McCord Museum. But we're thrilled and honored to be able to be presenting it, I think the only gallery out west, in a kind of new iteration. And it's gone through many twists and turns over the last couple of years. We were going to present it in 2020, and of course, life took a major twist, and we all know what happened next. But we had to, I guess, change directions, and so we're just thrilled and honored to be finally presenting this work here in 2022. It really relates to many of the things that we've been exploring over the decades here at the Surrey Art Gallery and been following their work as they've worked from Montreal since 2012. So we're just excited to have you finally with us this week and your work with us this summer. So please welcome Maya Ersan and Jamie Robson, Mere Phantoms. It's been so wonderful to have you here this week and finally installing this exhibition. We've been studying and thinking about your work a lot, and then we sort of had to put the brakes on things a few years ago, and then to come back into it in this current moment has been really extraordinary and something very special, and we'll talk a little bit about those sort of contexts in a moment. But I wanted to maybe begin by asking you how this particular project, Shadows Without Borders, came together back, 2018 and in the lead up to that, and maybe you could talk about the origins and what inspired the project to begin with.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So like Jordan said, Maya and I have been doing this work together since 2012, was our kind of first foray into paper cutouts and working with shadow. And from the beginning, the audience interaction, the participatory nature, the workshops, the kind of engagement with the work was really vital to us and what really inspired us and stimulated us to continue doing this work. And the handheld lights that we build, which you'll all see once you enter the exhibition, are something that from very early on we tried to make them unplugged. So a lot of what we use is very low tech, battery operated. And we just had this idea from the beginning that there was a lot of potential with this medium because of its simplicity to take it anywhere. And Maya being from Istanbul, that sort of led us to that part of the world, to have that opportunity to create really an unplugged kit that we could travel with and to take the work that, because we often do the work in gallery settings, and we really had this desire to take the work to populations that wouldn't otherwise make it into the gallery setting and sort of bring the gallery to them, bring the workshop environment to them. And fortunately, through the Canada Council, we were able to get the funding through the New Chapters grant, which offered artists, the invitation was to do something extraordinary, do something that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do with your standard arts funding. And as soon as we saw that call, we knew it was immediate for us. We knew exactly what we wanted to do. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you, Jordan, for that amazing introduction. I was amazed at myself just listening to it. But in 2013, I grew up in Istanbul, and I met Jamie at Emily Carr in university. And so through the years, she's visited me in Istanbul. I go back and forth all the time. And of course, when the civil war broke out in Syria in 2013, it was very obvious what was going to happen next, that people were going to become refugees. I also spent part of my childhood in Cyprus, so I knew really well that kind of tension and what happens in that geography the moment civil war breaks out. And we were really waiting for an opportunity. We had figured out how to, and for us it's always been interesting to see our art outside of the gallery space, although as thrilling as it is to be in the gallery as well, and to see how people interact with it outside of the art setting. So it was very clear that we wanted to take our medium and adapt it to being in places where there's no infrastructure. So refugee communities, satellite communities, camps, like anywhere we could get into, basically. And the process wasn't really easy necessarily. It was, I have a lot of relationships with communities that work with refugee settlements or communities in Turkey through my background and through working in Istanbul for years. So we approached them. We didn't try to go into the communities ourselves, but we approached people who already work on the ground.
Right.
Which was kind of our way in.
Yeah. Great. Well, we'll return to some of the specifics about that, those relationships that you had and you developed. But I was maybe sort of stepping back from that for a moment. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your interest in the medium, for lack of a better word, of shadows, and shadow theater, and that as a medium, because that was part of your practice going back many years. I think of the 3 Cities project you did with Montreal, Vancouver, and Istanbul at the Grunt, and other earlier shows. What is it about that this medium or approach to art making that has drawn you in and keeps you interested?
Yeah, it came about at a moment where we started experimenting with it. At first I was in Istanbul, Jamie was in Vancouver. We were kind of separated geographically for some years. And I didn't have a wet studio, as you call it. Like, I didn't have a place where it could be dirty, so I started really playing with paper. And when we met some years later back in Montreal, and we were, collaborating on different ideas together, I was working with paper, and Jamie has a background. She's done puppeteering, like worked with shadow puppets, and has actually worked with like a master shadow puppeteer in India, like years ago. Like, this is when we were super young. And so all of that started to gel together, and we had this one project for a Nuit Blanche in Montreal, which is like kind of the museums stay open all night and people come out. And the reaction we got was so overwhelming at that event that we just could see how this could all come together. Just having lights and having paper sculptures, and how that within itself was this entire area to explore. So it really started in that way. And the medium, those were mediums we were already interested in and had been investigating for years in different ways. And it was a moment that it all kind of came together.
Yeah, we're both very kind of tactile, craft-based artists. I guess I would bring that in as well. We come from a ceramics background, so it might not seem like the most natural jump from ceramics to paper. We actively have both practices today as well, but there's something about the immediacy of paper, the tactility of paper. We've always really consciously wanted to keep the work really low-tech, and that's where the joy in it is for us, that we can get away. We spend a lot of our hours of our day doing administrative work in front of the computer, but when we can get into making work, if we can get away from all those little technical glitches that can go wrong, and just simply paper and an X-Acto, that's all we need, and there's a lot of beauty in that. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I think about, like, when I look at the work, I see echoes of other contemporary artists like William Kentridge or say Kara Walker's use of silhouettes and other big name artists working today. But one of the things that I think is remarkable about your work is the collaborative community aspect of it, and this idea of collaboration is really central, it seems, to your practice. Not that it isn't in some cases with those other 2 artists, for example, but could you speak to this connection to working with community and working collaboratively, both in terms of yourselves as a duo and working with other folks on your art?
Yeah, absolutely. So Maya and I, in terms of our professional lives post Emily Carr, post art school, we both pursued community-oriented work, whether it be kind of public programming in a gallery setting, or Maya did tours with the Istanbul Biennial. There was always that kind of audience engagement element in our work in terms of our sort of professional life. And then, it was just very natural for us when we did start showing in galleries to sort of think about how the audience would engage in that work, because we had been sort of designing tours and thinking about how the public is engaged with other artists' work. So there's that, and then there's just a very natural chemistry between us in terms of our own collaboration. You know, we didn't set out saying we're going to spend, you know, the next decade collaborating together, but one show after another, it just became very natural, and the rhythm has shifted. Now it's come to a place where we kind of have a concept, maybe one or the other will come up with a bit of a concept for a show. We each build certain aspects of the show. We share ideas along the way. There's always a conversation. We did previously share more of a studio space. Now we have more of our own home-based studios. And then we get together, we share the work. So there's this just natural dialogue and kind of synergy that happens for us. Yeah, both in the studio and then in the gallery with the way that people engage and bring their work to life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're interested in the pedagogy behind, like pedagogy as an idea, like how we transmit knowledge from one person to another, and how that can be a collaborative process potentially. So that really takes form in our exhibitions, because you know there's making the artwork, and you can sort of make the artwork, it can exist on its own. You don't care where it goes, where it gets hung. It gets hung somewhere. And that's, you know, that's fine, that's okay. But I think the way we see it, we like to take over an entire space and really think about how is someone going to move through that space? Like, where are they going to stand? What are they going to experience? And also, like, what do they want to maybe experience? Like, if we were to give the mic to them, what would they say? Because we're interested to hear. The part that I like the best, which is like whenever we work in any community setting or we do workshops, is what people are going to come up with. Right. Because, you know, I have all kinds of ideas of what I want to cut from paper, but I get so inspired by seeing what people make and how they kind of, whether it's a dark thing or a happy thought or whatever it is, what kind of comes out in that medium. So that's it's a very kind of core kind of interest in collaboration in a deep way.
Yeah. I guess coming back to the kind of germ or seed for this project, which was the Syrian war and the refugee crisis, and you know, we worked with many folks from fleeing Syria and fleeing places like Afghanistan as well, the war there. And what did you learn about that direct experience, I guess, in part? Because one of the things that in sort of preparing for this exhibition is there's a real strong body of work by artists, contemporary artists working around this crisis, probably one of the chief crises or one of the major ones of our time. And we see what's going on with Ukraine and in Haiti and with Central American mass movements and people fleeing economic wars, environmental crises. But there's often a documentary approach to that work, and your work is really a very different approach, and play is really central. But these are very, you know, many people are coming from experiences of trauma, a very challenging time in there where their whole world has been turned upside down. So how do you kind of negotiate those very real emotions and difficult kind of terrain of people coming from those environments and working in the camps or the squats in Athens and Istanbul?
Yeah, I think often contemporary art takes a more documentary approach, like you said. I think, you know, you were mentioning Ai Weiwei's work, for example. Like, yeah, and it's very powerful work, of course. But like our work is I see it more similar to, we always have an uncomfortable relationship with contemporary art in a sense, maybe sometimes. Because I see it more like there's a company called the Flying Seagull, for example, based out of the UK. Now they're all over Europe, but they're a group of volunteers that go and perform with kids in camps. And that's all they do. They do all kinds of juggling, sort of theater work, all kinds of things. But I see a lot of more inspiration in that kind of work than documenting people's experiences. Because play is it's such a central and important part of childhood that, like, what we could do, like, we can't fix political problems. We can't, like, we felt so powerless, you know, in a way as artists. And, like, we thought, what can we do? And what we can do is create a situation in which people can play. and children can play, and families can play. So that's what we can do. And sort of that's our approach to a lot of different things, is that we're not documentary artists necessarily. We're not interested in collecting. We never asked people to tell us what they experienced. We were there. We said, we've got paper, we've got lights, we're going to do a shadow play in the evening after you make some puppets, you know. And through that process, they shared stories with us, and we heard absolutely, you know, unspeakable, like unimaginable kind of things that people had gone through. But it happened in an environment of just like talking about, just being there, and it wasn't solicited in any way.
And those weren't stories that you were going to share in your exhibitions?
No, it's not in the exhibition. It's there are mentions of some things in the documentary when the filmmakers are interviewing us of, you know, what was that moment about. But no, it's not, because it's not about the particular stories. It's about humanizing this extremely dehumanizing experience. It's each person that made a shadow puppet. We kept some of those whenever the kids wanted to give us the puppets, and they made so many during our workshops. You know, they took a bunch and we kept some, and we said, this is going around the world. You know, this is going to a museum in Canada. You know, like this is going to be in a show, and they were very proud of that, and they wanted to share that. So each one is like an individual person that made it, and that's the kind of tragedy behind all these stories, is that each one is an individual family's trauma and story and what they lived through.
And it seems like from the documentary and from our discussions and what I've read about the project also, there seemed to be a sense of empowerment, or like you had children who would take you to the squat in Athens to stage similar theater and installations in this other part of Athens once they learned about what you were doing in the camp. So what was that like to hear those stories?
Yeah, so like Maya said, that we really reflected on what could we offer, and what we could offer is a space for play. And often that is kind of the last thing on people's minds. You know, even the parents, the volunteers, like it's so much about meeting the basic needs of everyone, you know, sheltering people, creating a safe space. So we kind of came in with something fresh. We didn't have to think about all of those logistics that other people are taking care of. And what we could do was set up in, you know, an unused classroom or a rec room and just provide the materials for people to come and play in that space. And yeah, there are little references to some of the stories that people shared with us in the show. It's not so direct or so literal, but you know, for example, people shared stories with us about swimming from Greece to Turkey and training for a year for that. So if you look carefully in the exhibition, you will see some little swimmers. So it's very subtle, the way that we bring that in, and then through the documentary as well, there are references. But we don't, you know, we're not therapists, we're not art therapists. We don't try to bring that into it, but there is something that we can bring in terms of recreation, which is an art and creativity, which is actually so essential to the human spirit.
I know this, because of time, I think it would be a good time to maybe transition to some questions from the floor. I know I'd love to talk to you about your upcoming project in London, Ontario, because it is very much related, but are there any questions or reflections for those of you who have had a chance to see the work, or maybe seen past work and haven't seen this project, who might want to direct a question to Maya and Jamie?
Hello there. Thank you very much for hearing what you had to say. It's really reminds me how much it's important to root things in community, and that's definitely what you're doing in terms of looking at art and life and humanization in a different way as artists, and I really appreciate your perspectives on that. My question has to do with the traditions that shadow play and paper cutting come from in China, in the Philippines, in South Asia, and wondered how much of that has informed your work, either in terms of your process, in terms of your desire of rooting that in community, because it strikes me that that definitely came out of a community practice, and at a certain point became much larger than that, but even the gamelan societies and things like that. I was curious how much of that has informed your work.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's also, yeah, I grew up without ever seeing a shadow play in Turkey, and whereas during my parents' and their parents' lifetime, it was something that would happen during every Ramadan. So I was always very interested in the Turkish tradition is called Karagöz, which is very similar to the Greek one, and we fight all the time about who invented what. But it's the same, it's basically the same kind of two characters that are fighting. I was also really interested in the political side of shadow theater in the Turkish tradition, because there is, each play would start with this little poem, which is almost like a disclaimer. The things I'm saying here are from the light world and the shadow world, so you can't cut my head off about it, because it was a form of political protest, basically, during the Ottoman Empire. And whatever the puppets said, they couldn't be persecuted. And artists who did theater or stuff like that, they could be persecuted for going against whoever was in power at the time. So those kind of subtleties about the nature of how we perceive shadow was always fascinating to me. And Jamie has a whole other kind of history of working with traditional shadow puppetry as well. So that's definitely been an influence in our work. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many influences. I mean, I worked for many years with the Public Dreams Society that does so many public events, and there's always this light and shadow element. And in my travels, it was just a curiosity I had. I also worked doing puppet shows in schools, like educational puppet shows for some time. So I just naturally had this curiosity to learn more about it. And looking at the contemporary art world, we've always been inspired by artists like you mentioned, like William Kentridge and Kara Walker. There's also the Shadow and Light Society out in San Francisco, Larry Reed.
Shadow Light Productions.
Yes, which is a really community grassroots organization that does a lot of education and community empowerment using shadow and light. So there's all these various influences that have come into the work and then sort of gradually influenced what we do. But it doesn't draw on one specific tradition, I would say. Also early cinema and animation.
I think of expressionist cinema.
Yeah.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah.
And animation, we talked a little bit about.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Do we have enough time for another question?
Yeah.
Please?
Hi. So that was really inspiring and moving, and I can't wait to see your work. You mentioned administrative, and I'm just wondering how much time you have a studio practice, you have how much time goes towards arranging all this stuff versus actually doing the art versus spending time doing the workshop. I'm just curious to know how your week looks and the practice of those things.
Yeah, you don't want to know.
50-50 would be really nice.
It's not 50-50.
But it's not. No. Yeah, we also have a full-time ceramics practice. We have a small business. We give ceramics classes and have there's a whole other sort of life there.
We each have a toddler.
Yeah, we each have young children. And the paper and shadow work we do, it kind of comes in waves. Like when there is an exhibition coming up, then we get the opportunity to kind of push things off our plates for a bit, really focus our energy on that and dive into the studio. We are always looking for more of a balance in that, but it is quite incredible how much administrative goes into just organizing a show, just the background work of working with one museum, one gallery. Yeah, and then there's the fundraising part of it. We write our own grants. It's
it's a balancing act. If we can get 1.5 day a week of purely sitting down and making work, that's a really good week.
That's a success, the 20%.
But just before a show, we usually kind of buckle down and do it a bit more full time, which is kind of the thrill of and we don't see the work actually until we're in the gallery, because we don't have 30-foot walls in our studio, obviously. And so
we're big studios in Montreal.
Oh yeah, no. The Montreal real estate is supposed to be better, but it's not by much. But we don't actually see the work until we're in the gallery in its full form. So we're kind of working, we know what we're doing a bit, but for us it's a huge part of it.
They're really stunning objects and it's a beautiful process, and I love the degree of community engagement. You mentioned it actually being theater at some point. And I was wondering about that aspect. Do these objects turn into theater for the community, and how does that operate, if it does, or like what is that ongoing relationship with the community, and where does that go?
It's so when in the context of this particular show, Shadows Without Borders, we were doing shadow play sessions. So during the day, we would hold out workshops, and the kids would come in, and they would make puppets and houses and backgrounds and things like that. And we would tell them, okay, so in the evening we're going to do, we're going to play with these. It's not necessarily narrative, but basically we would have music, and we would operate the lights, and then they would come and they would sort of, bring alive their characters, do a little setup, do a really quick little skits for each other. It was very improv based. There was no time to really script anything or anything like that. So in the context of this show, that's how it worked. And I mean, they loved that. They would, sort of drag their parents over and sort of, do all this together. And they had all kinds of ideas. We didn't really need to say much in that way. And in other works, we've done more performative work as well. But that's it. It works a bit differently.
You did do some work with community in Montreal, did you not, with McCord, or more with the McCord audiences?
It was more a workshop setting in the museum, like in the making area. Yeah, we didn't do necessarily like theatrical, performative.
Yeah, because you have a practice that also in festivals and events like Push and where there's more, not so much a kind of museum type of presentation as well.
Yes. Yeah, whenever we do a workshop, we always end with shadow play. So, but it's very improvised, and a lot of what we do is very improvised too. For Push, we did actually have a performance. We were performing with the Shadow and Light.
Festival,
so that was a more performative work that we did. So it does happen, but more often it's in this gallery setting, and the audience is who kind of brings the work to life.
But it's a great question because we were invited to an architecture festival, for example, in Bulgaria, which we were like, the who? And we took over an abandoned gas station and turned it into like a shadow box, in a sense. Like it was all glass. And we covered it with this vellum-like thing. And then inside, we were playing with lights and putting sort of cutouts, and people were coming in and improvising. And we just invited people to, we were kind of manning the door, giving them lights, giving them puppets. And during the day, again, there were workshops for making puppets. So some of the people from the workshops came with their puppets. So it's this kind of very improv-based sort of practice in that sense.
Mm-hmm. And then very naturally an audience gathers, We don't necessarily say there's a show at such and such time, but very naturally an audience gathers on the street. Very impromptu, yeah.
It's amazing. Okay, well, we are going to need to wrap up. I will just mention, though, that if you're following and want to follow Mere Phantom's work, they have an exhibition. They're part of a big group show at Museum London in Ontario coming up this fall, and has some interesting sort of resonances with this project here in Surrey. So thank you so much for sharing some of the background on this exhibition and your practice. And again, it's really incredible to see the work now up and activated in the gallery space. So.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's really awesome.